So hello and happy Friday. Thank you for being with me here today. This is episode number 75 of questions and answers relevant to backyard beekeeping. The questions that we're going to talk about today were submitted during the last week over any of my various videos on YouTube, some through Facebook, some through my Fred's Fine Fowl website by filling out the form and submitting them. If you want to know what we're going to talk about today, please look down in the video description and you'll see them line item by line item, the topics we're going to discuss. And you can submit your own. It is 71 degrees outside. It is 80 degrees Fahrenheit in here, and we've had 580 thousandths of an inch of rain over the last 24 hours. But they say more is coming. Thank goodness, because the bees are really not bringing in a lot of nectar right now, although they did kick it in within the last week. All the plants seem dry, the environment's dry. We really could use a boost. So the storm that's coming through, and I want to give, shout out to those who are in the southern parts of the United States that have been hit and devastated by huge storms this past week. And I'm sure you're probably not watching this right now, but maybe at a later date, people have lost power. Over 300,000 people are without power. Anyway, the power will not go out in here because everything is on batteries. So what else can we talk about? This is the way to be. So now that we have that covered, these are the questions we're going to go through. I'm going to try to get through it pretty quick because I understand that some people don't like it when these things take too long. I agree. An hour and a half was long last week, so let's just get right into it. First one is from Henry Bendick. Thanks, Fred. I've built a similar version from your plan, talking about my feeder shim that goes on top of the hives. In the instance where you remove the wrap-it around feeder, why do you need the inner cover when the top cover is used? What happens with or without it in this instance? Thanks again, Henry. Okay, well, I did a drawing. I'm going to show you the feeder too. There is a video showing how I make my feeder shims. They're all weather, they stay on all year round, and they're designed so that you can feed your bees liquid or dry feed in the wintertime. So this is the drawing that I made today, which shows kind of a cutaway of that. It has an integrated bottom board. So the question here today is, if you notice, there's an inner cover there, and then there's the outer telescoping cover. So do we really need the inner cover there if we've got the feeder shim on and it's got its own built-in cover, and then there's that wrap-it around feeder sitting over the feeder hole? No, you don't need that inner cover there. Do you know why I leave it there? For convenience, so I know where it is. So if I pull this feeder shim off for any reason, the inner cover is already there, I just drop it down. Because of the wrap-it around feeder, you want to see a wrap-it around feeder? Happen to have it right here. Because wrap-it around feeder sits over that hole, and the wrap-it around feeder has its own cover. So the bees can't get up here. Now, excuse that this is dirty because I pulled it off, because I'm going to sanitize this with chlorinated water coming up really soon. But the way this is made, the bees come up through the center hole, they go up over the top here, and now if we're feeding liquid, technically they couldn't get out unless what you're feeding them drains all the way to the bottom, and then they come out through the bottom of this clear cover here. When you're feeding dry feed, they could come up in here, and that's why we need the cover. And what do I mean by dry feed? For me, it's just sugar. That's an emergency feed for me in the wintertime in the event that the bees run out of the stored honey that they've saved through the year. The other thing is, I want you to notice on here, there is a sock over that center riser, and all that is a child's Hanes cotton sock. I cut the ankles off of them and I push them down over these wrap-it around feeder centers, and that way the bees have something to hang on to and you don't open it up and find a bunch of drowned bees in there. So anyway, the inner cover, what's the feeder shim look like? And we're going to talk about this to answer a later question today too, but this is my feeder shim, and it has a built-in bottom board, and this thing is very thick. You'll notice over an inch of thickness here through the hole. And also I put these screens in here for venting through the back, and that's what it looks like. And then relevant to the question, the wrap-it around feeder sits over the center, covers the feeder hole. Bees can't get up in here anyway. So why do I have that inner cover on there? Just a placeholder. you can just put your telescoping cover over the top. The bees can't access this area. What would happen if I left this off and the bees did get up in this area and then I just had the inner cover over the top of it? Let me tell you ahead of time, they're going to make a huge mess because they're going to fill this whole area with comb. And it's going to be feral comb. They're just going to run it any direction they want. They're going to fill out with honey, and you can actually use that to cut out your own chunk honey if you want to. That instance would require you to make sure and put your inner cover on there, because they're also going to attach the comb to the underside of that inner cover, and you're going to be prying that off, and you're going to be doing damage to the comb, and there's going to be honey leaking everywhere. But it will allow you, that inner cover being in place will allow you to get your outer cover off so you can access the inner cover, so you can get that off so you can access this space. So if you want to run wild comb through some part of your hive and harvest it later, leaving that space open is one way to do that. I don't do it because I don't want to deal with the mess. The same thing happens if you leave your inner cover. What's an inner cover? I'm going to show you two types. Here's a solid inner cover with a feeder, which is also designed for a bee escape too. And look, here's another one that's clear. So that's an inner cover so that you can look in on your bees without exposing them to cold or whatever. So this inner cover, whenever we put that on your hive, this just gives the bees something to seal up against the weather. You should be blocking this hole in general, although some people cut grooves through here so they can vent a little bit through the top, and then the telescoping cover goes over the top of that. Lots of different configurations for inner covers too. And that covers that part. So that's what I'm doing. I do it with my piece of paper. So no, it's not necessary. I just leave my inner cover there so I know where it is, so I don't have to track it down later. The next question comes from Landon. I have a question maybe you can answer. If I were to leave some honey on for winter feed and treat them with oxalic acid vaporization is what I do, and that's to treat the Varroa destructor mite that parasitizes your honeybees and passes on a whole pile of different diseases. Would I be able to use those frames next year to collect honey from? So for example, if you had all of your hive bodies stacked and going into winter, we have 50 to 100 pounds of surplus honey on so that the bees can get through a winter in the northern United States where the weather gets really cold, or anywhere where you see weather extremes where you get a lot of snow and extended cold periods. The bees will consume that honey. So the question here is relevant to if we're treating with oxalic acid vaporization, then we know that you're not supposed to have your honey supers on because that's what it says on the label. Why can't we have it on the honey supers if oxalic acid residue is already in the honey? Because it's ubiquitous in the environment and many, many plants already have oxalic acid in them, and therefore the bees are already putting it into the comb and into the honey, and it's almost impossible to tell the difference between the honey that's been exposed to oxalic acid vaporization as compared to that which has not, but that's beside the point. We're going to follow the label. The label says honey supers cannot be on if they're intended for human consumption when you treat with oxalic acid vaporization. So why not treat the colonies, and then how do I protect the honey for the following spring? So when the bees survive, and if they don't use all their honey, and I have this big surplus, can I use that then for human consumption? So to do that, I have to make sure that that honeycomb full of capped honey is not exposed when doing oxalic acid vaporization. Well, you might wonder as to whether or not that is worth the effort really. Because here's what I like to do. I personally treat with oxalic acid vaporization twice a year as necessary based on mite counts. If you don't have high mite counts, don't treat with oxalic acid vaporization or oxalic acid dribble or whatever you're using. So here's the thing. I do it after we've extracted honey, which is going to be the second week of September for me here, into possibly the third week. Once that's off and the bees have cleaned everything up, then we do our oxalic acid vaporization treatment for the hives that need it. Then, every bit of honey that they collect from there going forward is for the bees going into winter. So that will be honey that has not yet been exposed to oxalic acid vaporization, and hopefully you're leaving 2 to 3 weeks of time for your bees to bring in those resources at the end of the year, and store up for winter. So I did a little quick sketch here to help you visualize what I'm talking about. Now I like to leave at least a deep box, which is going to be brood, some honey, pollen, and some bees, of course. So brood, pollen, and honey on a small scale in the deep box here. Then the medium super, generally where I live, will be full wall to wall with honey. So that's about 47 pounds of honey in a medium super. So I already kind of have what I need to get my bees through winter. Last winter they used almost everything they had, so we were walking a fine line. Now, if you add a third box, and that gets full of honey too, so technically now we have 2 medium-sized boxes that have honey in them. This one is what we're talking about. If you come to springtime and that is nothing but honey, could you pull it off and use it? Well, if you didn't put that on until after you did your oxalic acid vaporization, then yes, you can use it. Because here's the thing, I leave these 2 deep boxes, the deep and the medium, on in the beginning of the year, and I let them fill it up. So they have been using this, cycling this full, and also removing some of the honey from the second box, and then refilling and removing and refilling and removing. And they also have some brood in this box, but it's predominantly honey. So this is what I have on, and then if it's a flow hive, the next thing is a flow super, or a honey super that you're going to pull off, or a Ross round, or something else like that. But since this doesn't go on until you've drawn off your last straw, then you put this back on to let them build up more surplus for the wintertime, then that should be during the period after you've done your oxalic acid treatments. Now here's why I say, is it even worth it? Because you don't leave a queen excluder on. Also, if you already have the honey on and you don't have the time, because let's face it, we're getting near the end of the year, you're going to have to get the bees out of there. So in order to remove that top box so that you can treat your lower boxes, you have to put a bee escape in there. So something like this would go underneath that top honey super. Then once the bees are out of it, because face it, we have to treat all the bees, then you're going to pull that box off, then you're going to treat the hive, then a couple hours later you can put that box back on. And to quote Randy Oliver, nobody cares about that exposure, but I have to say, you have to follow the guidelines and the regulations when it comes to using oxalic or any other pesticide that's supposed to intervene on your behalf against the mites. So now let's say we did that, and then we have that top box on there, and we plan to draw that off in spring. What are the bees going to do through winter? Through the winter time, your bees are going to be in a cluster down here at the beginning of winter, somewhere around here, and they're going to migrate up through these. I have almost never seen it where we got to springtime and the bees were not in the top box with brood and everything else. So your chances of having a honey super that stayed on all the way through winter that has no brood use and no brood in it come spring, when you can draw off that surplus, is extremely rare. Now, I can go in there and pull out 3 or 4 out of a 10 frame box that would be solid wall-to-wall honey that the bees just never touched it during winter, but other frames will have some brood in it, so you can't draw those off anyway. So you might realistically only be talking about a few frames of honey per hive. And then what if you had a dearth in the spring and they needed that honey? So it's a toss-up whether or not that's worth it for you. I pull off surplus honey starting this coming week, the week after that, and after that it's going to all be for the bees. So most of my hives are already full of honey now. So pulling it off, treating, putting it back on, and then waiting till winter to draw it off in the spring again, unless you're using a queen excluder to keep them out of it, which I highly recommend you do not do, because your bees, the cluster, is going to want to go up into that honey super to make use of those resources. And if there's a queen excluder, you can leave your queen behind and a lot of the workers. If there's brood, the entire cluster might not move and they'll just starve to death. So there's a lot to think about there. I personally don't think it's worth it by that time of the year, going through winter and then counting on those resources in spring. Here's the next question from John. He has goldenrod has begun, no shortage of resources, bees are working like crazy, the queens are laying up of multiple frames per hive, 2 colonies of Purdue anchor biter mite mauler bees. Purdue ankle biter mite mauler bees means that not only do they groom off the Varroa destructor mites, but they chew them up, they bite their feet off and everything like that. So really good line of bees. I get similar results out of the bee weaver bees that are in the observation hive over here. They chew up the mites, they bite their feet off. And but these are Purdue ankle biters that I purchased from a breeder in West Virginia as 5-frame nucleus colonies for a pretty steep price. Yesterday, I did an abbreviated hive inspection to see how one of the queens was handling the deep super I had already added to an Apimaye 10-frame. Apimaye is a type of hive that is plastic clad and polystyrene in the middle, and it is super insulated, and it is proprietary. It only works with Apimaye equipment, and so this is a super insulated hive. I stocked the super with better comb to focus the bees on work rather than producing wax. Better comb is that synthetic pre-drawn imitation beeswax. And my queen was in the super, and the entire frame was wall-to-wall capped brood. Michelin Men, purple-eyed pupa. And there was also a capped swarm cell on the bottom of the frame. I squished this cell and fed it to a chicken. I closed up the hive, and I am trying to decide whether or not to split this colony. My reasoning is that if the colony has produced this cell, they intend on taking my $250 queen with them. And since she's not yet a year old, I would rather take her with the 5 frames into a new hive to keep her around and get my money's worth, and let the big hive produce their own queen from an additional swarm cell that I will inevitably find in the lower brood chamber. Is it too late to do this? I feel if I don't, she will be lost to the trees. Thanks to the great videos. Okay, so this actually came up recently, and have an idea about how to do this. Because let's face it, what was today's date? We're near the end of August already, so we're coming into September. Depending on where you are, where I am, we're coming to the end of the productive year with the bees. So, if you're going to make a split right now, what do we have to have if we want that split to succeed? I agree that it looks like the bees are getting ready to get rid of this expensive queen. By the way, breeder queens are super expensive if you buy those in. So hundreds of dollars. This is a $250 queen. So anyway, this is what I would personally do. Since they're planning to swarm and they're making their preparations and they don't have time really to create, if you do a split, pull it off, put the queen, bunch of brood and stuff in another box so that she's taken care of. Then we have the hive that she came from, which has all the resources. They're the ones that were kicking her out. So now, where are we at by the time we have, if today is August the 28th, we're talking the end of September when eggs from that queen start hatching out. So by then, that normally, you're going to have to feed them, you're going to have to take care of them and boost them a lot. But I have another plan. I suggest that you do take the queen, take brood frames, create a nucleus colony, set her all up there, and then let the other colony try to produce a new queen. And when they produce those queen cells, you go in there and you take them out of there. You destroy them. And then you do weekly inspections. Because if you do weekly inspections, you're going to find out whether or not they're still producing queen cells. How will you know if there's anybody still laying in there? There won't be any more eggs. You don't have to worry about layer workers. Laying workers happen at about the 3rd week absent a queen. So when the queen pheromone goes away, those ovaries on the female workers can become active and they can become layers, and that's when we start seeing drone brood scattered kind of all over the surface instead of a nice even pattern. Like this is an even pattern of brood. But if you don't see evidence that they are able to produce another queen, because what's the window? They have to have eggs from the queen that you just took out of there. So you're only going to see eggs as eggs for up to 3 days. At the 3rd day, they're going to hatch into larvae. The larvae are critical. You have to use those to make a new queen within a day after they've hatched. So if you go a week and you don't see new queen cells and you've caught up with them, then you're good to go. They are queenless. Now, what I highly suggest, because we have a break-in brood in that hive, okay, and they're queenless, so they're no longer trying to get rid of their queen, and they've lost the pheromone from the queen that you removed. So they no longer recognize her. So go 2 weeks, let's say. Meanwhile, the queen's over here in another nucleus colony, and she's building up, and she's got her frames of brood, and she's okay, and she's healthy, and everything else. Now bring her back. Combine that with your deep, and what they think is that you've brought in a new queen that's fertile, that comes with all of her own resources, and they're likely to accept her. And then you satisfy two things. You saved your queen, you satisfy their urge to swarm, you restore them to the original box, and now they're queen right again, and it's probably too late for them to even think about getting rid of that queen again. Now you have your less than a year old Purdue ankle biter queen going into wintertime in time for them to make fat-bodied winter bees, which are critical in getting them through. So we have this great survivor bee. We're going to get her back. If you try that, let me know if it works. I accept no responsibility for the potential for that to fail, because nobody can adequately predict exactly what bees are going to do, but it's better than losing everything. And I do think it's too late in the year to be starting a split, because I don't see any drones right now, to be honest. Like, I looked through my whole apiary, 1, 2 drones, 3, 4. Not enough to provide the environment for drones to be flying out, because I use that as an indicator of what's going on possibly in drone congregation areas where virgin queens have to fly to mate. If my apiary is not producing enough drones, then I make the assumption that other apiaries and other beehives, even miles from here, might be in a similar situation, because we've had really dry weather and the environment's not providing. So what's the first thing to go? What's the first thing these observation hive bees did when we ended up with a dearth and the nectar flow slowed way down? They went around through here and they started eating out all the eggs that were in these cells, and those cells are totally clean. And the queen's in there. She's good to go. But what happens is, in the absence of resources coming in through the hive, they don't produce young. It's just a natural instinct. You don't produce what you can't feed. And that's what happens to the drone numbers too. That's why the drones have fallen way off, because they're the first to go. They're eaters. So the colonies get rid of them. So try that method. Let me know if it works. Hope it does. Also, if you think that's a good idea or a bad idea, please feel free to write it down in the comment section below this video. And we'll see how that goes. But that's what I personally would do. I take the queen out, create a fake swarm, bring her back. We talked about that last time. I think it's going to be great. I think that works. I'm going to try that next time I have that situation myself. Next one comes from Gary from the United States, Massachusetts. My bees are not building any honey for winter. Lots of bees, big field of vegetable, and sunflower. What can I do? Okay. You get a colony of bees that are not building honey for winter. Here's the problem. That's the problem with dearth periods. The Northeast has had periods of dearth this year, and which is kind of rare for a lot of those areas, because generally they have a lot of resources in the environment and the bees can access them to bring in pollen and nectar. They need both. So sugar syrup and pollen substitute might help, barely bridge things, but it is not a replacement. It is a substitute. So what can you do? Well, we can't have your bees in profound decline going into winter, especially at a time when they need to make those winter bees. So you're going to have to feed those bees. You're going to have to give them a 5-gallon pail of ProSweet over there, emergency backup. The other thing is, I highly recommend not open feeding those resources when we have a dearth period, when we have critical hives. While some are doing well, others are not doing so well. Do the feeding inside the hive in something like a feeder shim on top. Try not to use those entrance feeders, because those can also stimulate robbing. But in this instance, given what's going on this year, and you risk losing your colony of bees because they may not build up strong enough for winter, what density of sugar syrup will they be putting in their cells and storing, similar to honey? 2 to 1. So 2 parts sugar by weight to 1 part water. So we want to get that in there because it's an emergency. The other thing is, we're going to feed a fall pollen substitute because the pollen is really dry or the plants aren't producing enough. Ultra B is the only thing I would recommend. Ultra B dry pollen substitute. I would not put patties inside the hives personally. But the pollen substitute you feed outside, because the other question that comes up is, can I just put pollen sub in the sugar syrup and make the bees take it in? I much prefer that you let your bees make that choice difference. Dry pollen, separate by itself, and then the liquid sugar syrup off separate, also inside the hive. Pollen outside the hive, that's totally okay. So, and then that's what they do. So I would do that because big field of vegetables, sunflowers are providing some pollen. I have thousands of sunflowers out there. And I would say that my apiary, which is less than 100 yards from it, there are only probably 600 or 700 bees at a time in that sunflower field. Most of the bees out there are native pollinators like bumblebees and so on. So the honeybees are out getting other things. So the sunflowers don't necessarily provide the big boost they need. The other thing, it says a big field of vegetables. Vegetables in general are not a huge source of nectar and pollen for your bees either. So the long-standing, the ones that give you an extended release, hyssop just started blossoming this week, so that's doing great. Goldenrod is going to be a strong resource for your bees. And also we're going to have asters will be blooming soon. So those things will provide nectar and pollen to help bolster your bees. And so it doesn't hurt in an emergency situation, Massachusetts, I would start feeding inside the hive, because if they don't need it, when they start finding what they need outside, they'll back off on what you're providing as a supplement. But if you don't provide the supplement and the resources are not there in the environment, you go into winter with a weak colony that's undersupplied, and you have to feed them all winter. So why not front load that, feed them now? Some people go as far as to feed them back any honey that they've taken off, because the honey goes immediately from the honey feeder. And for honey, we don't put that in something like, do not put honey in a wrap it around feeder like that. You would put honey in the jars that are inverted, they have the holes in the lid, those are fed up in top, and so they lick through the jars and they get the honey out of that. But honey is 1-to-1, it's ready to go. The energy is not expended to process honey, because they're going to pull it out of the jar and put it right in the cells. When the cells are full, they're going to cap them. So in an emergency, feeding them back honey, they also need the pollen. Next one is from Jera Bees from New South Wales, Australia. So I live in Canberra, Australia, and we have 2 flow hives. Over winter, I have insulated each with sheets of packaging, polystyrene foam. And now, as we come out of winter, the population looks healthy and strong. Venofarms does something similar. But I think he's lost the occasional hive. We don't have the same severe snowed-in winters here as you do over there. But I was wondering if there is a downside to overwintering with insulation like this. For example, does it upset the seasonal cycle of the queen or the hive? So here's the thing, Venofarm, good channel to check out because he does super insulate his hives. Insulated or not insulated? That's the question. Because there are arguments on both sides. A super insulated hive takes less energy for the bees to maintain their climate inside. A less insulated hive. Now, you should also know that, by the way, I am happy for people to keep bees in a variety of different ways, and there is no absolute bottom line, do it my way or stop talking to me kind of thing. If you insulate your hives, great. If you don't insulate them and they do well, you don't need to fix what's not broken. So the argument is, and I've been doing this for a long time, going to the 14th winter with bees. And one of the things that is said here, appears to have lost a hive or two. Well, let me tell you something. Here in the United States, people lose more than a hive or two. They lose 20 to 45, in some cases 50 or 60% of their hives in the wintertime. So if somebody has 20 hives of bees and they've lost a hive or two through winter, that would be considered outstanding. So there are people keeping bees, all the way up in the northeastern United States, Canada. They move them in. There are percentages of loss that if somebody's coming through with 100% survival, extremely rare, extremely rare. I lost 1 colony last winter. That is the best I have ever come through in a winter. In the past, I've lost as high as 60% when I was doing treatment-free bees, survivor line bees exclusively, and not treating with, for Varroa or anything else. So based on that, I lose colonies of bees. So here's what I'm going to suggest. Because one of the things I do when my bees are lined up, my hives are lined up through wintertime, is I do thermal scans of the hives because I like to see where's the cluster of bees. So there's a thermal footprint on the front of the hive because those things only read surface temperature. So I already know if this would represent 3 deeps, right? So my bees start out their winter right around in here in their cluster, and that's good. I take a thermal and I see, and on the outside, like let's say it's 29 degrees outside, that will show a surface temperature on that box of about 39 or 40 degrees. So all I'm looking for is an elevation in temperature. Then I can shoot that. So I don't open the hives. I can shoot the outside of a 3/4 inch thick wooden box. I can shoot the thermals and see where they are and if they're doing okay. Now when they get up to the top, if this was the top of the hive, then I know, they're using all the resources, they're already at the top, and it's only January 5th or something like that. Now I know that I might be having to do emergency feeding on those hives. My goal is not to feed them. Now if they're doing that in an uninsulated hive, what happens, when we get one of those midwinter warm-up days? Hives that are insulated are very slow to respond to an exterior warm-up because the insulation, of course, insulates them both from heat on the outside as well as cold. So the inside temperatures, as far as the bees know, there are batteries that store cold and heat in your hive. What is it? That's the honey. So the honey gets really cold. Your bees are not warming up that honey unless it's the honey they are directly on and that they are directly consuming. The rest of the honey, so if they're on this frame right here and there's 2 or 3 frames of honey over here, these frames are basically at the outside temperature. So warm or cold, they're holding that temperature. And those frames, if this box, let's say this is the eastern side of your beehive, and the sun rises and warms the outside of that wood and starts to warm that honey over there, the bees start to break cluster in here and they migrate over and they start utilizing some of that honey along that warm side. Which is why sometimes, we're looking at the front, here's all the hive frames. Eastern side gets a lot of warmth. That's when you start to see the cluster start migrating around the frames and getting over to that side. And then when it gets cold again, there they are and there they stay. Now if that warm up happened later in the day, then we've got the western side over here, and then you'll end up seeing them migrated over here to that warm side. Now if the hive is super insulated, they don't feel that warmth on the side of the box. The honeycomb, the capped honey, doesn't start to warm up. Condensation forms on the surface of it too, so they go and they lick that off as well. If it gets, warmed up on the inside of the hive, super insulated hive, all of that cold honey stays cold much longer. It's kind of like, it gets really warm outside, but you walk out into your garage and it's still really cold in the garage because you have a concrete floor, assuming, and you have all these other resources that hold the cold longer, and because they're not being warmed by the sun, they don't warm up. And there's also condensation on that concrete floor. Have you noticed? So, I know this is a very ambiguous answer, but here's what I'm telling you. You might have low humidity where you live. It may not matter. They may need condensation inside the hive a little bit to give them the water resources because they can't fly out because it's too cold. So they get condensation at the edges of the cluster, outside the cluster. When you look at this all stays dry and warm, and then you see a ring down here because the entrance is at the bottom. The cold air comes in, clashes with warm air here, they get condensation here, and guess what we see the bees doing when they start moving? Licking off the condensation from the inside because they're thirsty. So here's what I recommend for you if you want to try it out. This is why we have more than one hive here. I would suggest leaving enough honey on. That's number one, leaving enough honey on to get your bees through winter. Generally, 47, 50 pounds where I live is enough for a standard sized colony of bees to get through winter. Some people will say you need 100. Well, if you leave 70 or 100 pounds on, then that's not totally wasted, I suppose, but it may be unnecessary. You don't want to create a huge space for your bees to manage. But I would do one hive insulated, one hive not, and I would face their entrances to the south. This entrance on this building faces east, south or east where I live. And of course, be mindful about prevailing winds and things like that. And then you'll have a comparison. How do they come through winter? the ones that warm up, they get that early warm up with the sun and everything, they get active in there, they also do their cleansing flights sooner than hives that are well insulated like that. So find out. Try, experiment. Keep notes. Exactly what did you do? What kinds of bees were you keeping? How were they set up when they went into winter? How many boxes did you, how many frames were in there? How many frames were full of honey? Was there a bunch of pollen in there too? What were their resources going in? What was the hive strength going into winter? And how are they situated? As detailed as you can be. And then find out how they make it through winter. How some of those hives do, because we've had insulated hives not do so well. In fact, overwhelmed with condensation. And that's just based on reports from other beekeepers in my area that have tried different things. So, and again, climate situations vary. My climate right here differs from the climate just 10 miles to the north of me. I am at 1,300 feet above sea level. 10, 15 miles to the north of me, they're at 500 feet above sea level. So we have different situations here, even different rainfall amounts and things like that. So, it's worth experimenting. More than one hive, if you've got several hives, this is your chance to start figuring out what's going to work the best for your bees. The saying is old, but it's true. Your bees don't die of cold, they die of starvation. So a good cluster of bees, a strong cluster of bees, is going to make it if you've sheltered them from wind, if you've provided them with ventilation through the bottom of that hive. And this is another parting point when it comes to beekeepers, whether or not you provide ventilation out the top or not. I don't. I used to. Whether you have upper entrances or not. I don't. I used to. And I started doing that very thing. 4 hives over here with upper entrances and venting through the top. 4 hives over here with no upper entrances and no venting through the top. How did they do? For me, the ones without the upper vents, without the upper entrances, overall did better than those that had them. So where I live, in my climate, they do better without. Now, do I think that my bees might benefit a little bit from insulation? I think they probably could, but it's unnecessary since they're making it without. That's how I look at it. Okay, the next one here. I hear that wax moths can digest plastic. This comes from Angela. I understand that wax moths can digest plastic. Their digestive enzymes are being studied for waste disposal. Well, it's not the wax moth, by the way, that eats the plastic. And this is based on a study that some grad students were doing. And it was the wax worms themselves. The wax worms are the ones that mess up your honeycomb. They eat your bees' wax. They set up house when your bees can't keep up with them. Usually I only find it in hives if I'm storing equipment and I haven't ventilated it well, or a hive, bees absconded from it and I didn't get in there right away and clean it up. Then you end up with wax moths laying eggs, and then the wax moth larvae, the wax worms, are then in there, and they're the ones that are consuming those resources and making that mess in there by spreading their webs all over the place. Now what happened was, this grad student was doing research on wax worms, and they put a bunch of them in a plastic bag, like those, package store bags, plastic bags. They put a bunch of wax worms in it, and they closed them up, and they set them on a table. Well, those wax worms were trapped, so what did they do? Chewed holes, got out. So you might be thinking, they just chewed the hole to get out of there. There's no way that they actually ate the plastic. But you see the way science works. They thought it was interesting that not only did they chew holes in that bag, but there weren't like remnants. It's like a mouse. When it chews something up, like going through plastic or through a wall or something, they leave a bunch of chewed up bits and pieces on the ground. When a carpenter bee drills a hole into your wooden shed, it creates a little sawdust pile. So there were no remnants of the plastic bag that the wax worms had gone through. So then they thought, is it possible that they ate them? Yeah, they might have ingested plastic. So then what did they do? They smash those wax worms, and then they see what's in their gut. Now, what you might think is that it's plastic. So the plastic would be undigested in their gut system. But that was not the case. The plastic was actually partially digested, which means that the wax worms had the ability to consume plastic and actually digest the plastic, making it something that would decompose in the environment. How cool is that? Now the trick is, the only reason they ate the plastic in the first place was because they had to get out of there. So we know that wax worms in beehives that have wax frames, like Acorn or Peerco or Mann Lake, the waxworms they stop when they get to the end of the beeswax that's on the face of that foundation, and they stop consuming it when it hits the plastic. So they're not hungry for plastic, they're not going after plastic. But the thinking scientifically is, of course, that if they were given only plastic to eat, that they might consume it and actually digest it. Therefore, we might have found a way to recycle some plastic using waxworms. So that's where that comes from. Angela did not cite where she learned about that, but I do remember that because I listened to that lecture. I want to say she's a doctoral candidate or she's doing her master's in entomology. And if you know the study, please go ahead and put a link down in the comment section below this video so others can look in on it. There's a video about it where she reports her findings. So I'd be interested to get an update on that. But yep, they sure did. They digested the plastic from plastic bags. Next one's from Lewis. Dear Fred, I've recently been watching some of your beekeeping vlogs and videos. I like your inspection hive. I'm considering making one and have a question about how far would be okay for the bees to travel in a tube. As the best viewing area and best entrance exit are not necessarily at the same place, or too close, for example, is 6-meter tube much too far? Will they just deal with the distance? Failing this, I could adjust the location. Also, should the width of the inner cavity just be the width of 2 frames and so forth? Okay, here's the thing. The bees in these observation hives, first of all, the bees don't like observation hives. They can't stand them. They would not move into an observation hive on their own. Why? Because the interior space is inadequate. They just don't like them. But of course, once we install, brood frames and everything else in these observation hives, of course, they stay. They survive in spite of us. This observation hive has a single hole going through the bottom. It's 1.5 inches in diameter, and it makes a 90-degree, and then it goes out the door. So the entire length of it is about 6 or 7 inches to the outside. This says 6 meters. I would not run a 6-meter tube from an observation hive. Would the bees travel the 6 meters? I think they would. It's a huge amount of extra effort when bees are just crawling and walking around. The other thing is, that's a venting source for the hive. So I don't know if you've ever done this as a kid. Take a garden hose and you decide to breathe through it. So you get down in the water and first of all, you find out the pressure on your lungs works against you trying to take a deep breath, so you have to stay shallow. But the other thing is, each time you exhale through this tube and inhale again, you're recycling air that never made it to the end of the tube because it's just too long, you can't clear it. So I apply this principle to beehives. If they're venting air out and drawing fresh air in, the longer the tube or the connection to the outside world is, the less efficient that's going to be for the bees. So I think that, yeah, a 6-meter tube is way too long. I don't know that anybody has studied how far the bees have been found to have a natural cavity with a tube. But let's say they're in the side of a tree and then the hollow of a tree. The exterior of that hollow probably would max out at about 6 inches in thickness, assuming there's already an excavation in it. The bees are occupying it, and now we've got the outer wall of the tree. So 2 inches to 6 inches would be the maximum. But now that we're talking about entrances, so my answer to that is I would locate that observation hive in a place where you can have the shortest possible run to get them out. And so they can ventilate through that and draw fresh air in. So the other thing is, I want to talk about this because we're coming up on wintertime, and I want to talk about the hive placement and so on. Also, I want to talk about the entrance reducers. Because you're going to put these on in wintertime. What else do people want to put on their entrance reducer in wintertime? They want to put mouse guards on. I say you do not have to put a mouse guard on your beehive at all. None, zero, nada. Where do I get that idea? Well, Dr. Thomas Seeley at Cornell has done a lot of course, inspections and evaluations on what kind of entrances bees choose on their own, what sizes they prefer when given many options. And they arrived at a 5.5-inch long opening that is only 3/8 of an inch in height. And when you have a 5.5-inch long opening, and that's for any size colony of bees, large or small, when you have that 3/8 of an inch height, guess what can't get in there? A mouse can't get through that. So a wide yet narrow top to bottom entrance would preclude the entrance of a mouse. Therefore, no entrance reducers for mice are necessary. The entrance reduction is, I've had people blast me. If you put up a video and they see that part of your entrance is reduced, and people are like, why are you reducing the entrance? Why are you not opening the whole thing up? Your bees are obviously having a problem with that. I open all my hives, all my entrances all the time. Well, again, I'm going to take you back. I'm going to shield myself with the science of Dr. Seeley's research. Dr. Seeley's research says that the bees don't like those big open entrances for a number of reasons. The other thing is I've put screens in instead of the solid wooden entrance reducers because it allows them the ventilation without the stress of having to defend a large opening. So when the bees were provided with a variety of different lengths of this opening, they optimized themselves at 5.5 inches in length and 3/8 in height. I don't know why I want to say 3/16. 3/8 of an inch in height. Now, Matthias Wandel, who has a great channel, did all these studies of how big the holes are that mice could get through. So I took his research and I applied that to the entrance reducers. He's not a beekeeper. He's just a science guy, off the chart genius. And so we use his research on what mice can get through. And now we don't have to have those grids. We don't have to put hardware cloth on there. And Bee Smart Designs has a entrance reducer screen, that white screen. I don't happen to have one handy, or I'd show it to you. But it has little standoffs on the bottom of that raise it up 3/8 of an inch. And so it becomes also a mouse guard while allowing your bees full entrance and egress. How cool is that? So I wanted to mention that because because I'll be shifting over probably to wooden entrance reducers on some of my hives, not all of them. And I'll be using those small entrances because we don't want mice to get through, but I also want to be able to clear the dead bees out without having to remove some kind of mouse guard. The other thing I want to talk to you guys about is, this is an exaggerated illustration, of course, tilt your hives towards the entrance, towards the landing board as we go into winter. Why do we do that? It's twofold. One, we want rain and snow that piles up on here, rain that hits it, snow that piles up as it melts. We want it to run out, not in. The other thing is, if there's any condensation that gets up along these walls or across the surface of the interior roof of the hive, when that starts to melt, we want it to run off to the front and down and out. We don't want it to be perfectly level front to back. We want our hives level left to right, front to back. We want them tilted towards the landing board now that we're coming into winter. So if you are putting in wooden entrance reducers on your hives, 5.5 inches in length, 3/8 of an inch in height opening, then you don't have to worry about the mice. That's that. Next one. This is from Bobby, Missouri, Lebanon, Missouri. Have you tried, and if so, do you like adding supers under the brood box and to let the bees move down and then add an excluder on top to turn the top box into the super? No, I haven't. I don't. I used to use medium boxes, and now my configuration is consistently a single deep, and then the mediums are above that. And that single deep is always my brood box. I rotate frames in and out of there. I also put the slatted racks under that now, which has increased the amount of comb that the bees build all the way down to the bottom of the frames, where before they didn't. But for those who want to do medium supers and things like that, see, I don't do the under supering thing because the point is in springtime, although I would say that my observation hive here is making me look bad on that philosophy, but again, this is an observation hive. It only has 8 frames in it. But if we had a great year, what they should have done, they did use their top box on their own, unrestricted. There's no queen excluder in here. So that whole top pair of frames is nothing but wax and nectar and finished honey. Then we come down here. I would like to have seen them move their brood down, and I would like to see all their brood in these bottom two frames. But this year they didn't. This year I've got brood consistently through the year down in what would be the third box. But remember, this is only 8 frames total. So this is not a good representation. But in springtime, they always end up at the very top, and then they start to migrate down. So this spring, when we came out of winter, all of the bees in this observation hive were in this top box, and that's where they started their brood. So you can see now that it has been converted to nothing but honey. So they just didn't complete moving down here. Now the other thing that can also keep your bees up high when they don't need to be is you can have brood up there because there's an entrance or a venting area up there, because they tend to focus their brood on the side or in the area where you have ventilation to and from the hive. So on this side is where the venting is for the bees in this observation hive. And this side there is no venting, and we don't see a strip of brood going through here. So they like to be near where there is an entrance or a vent. And that's also in the absence of a queen excluder, they would move closer to an upper vent in spring. So for those, I just did a drawing. There are advantages for some people if you want to do nothing but medium boxes all the way up. And that is that you would only have to get medium frames. You don't need deeps and mediums. You also only have medium boxes. You don't need deeps and mediums. And the other thing is that a full frame, 10 frame medium box weighs about 47 pounds when it's full of honey. So you could lift all these boxes. The other advantages, what we're talking about with this question is if it came to springtime and your brood and your bees were up here and this bottom box were completely empty, they're 100% compatible. They're both mediums. You could rotate them under super, whatever you want to call it. And you take the top box, make it the bottom box, and then they, again, as the season progresses, they migrate up through these boxes, building stores, resources, and again, the following year, you do the same thing again. So with the deep boxes, you tend to leave the deep box as the brood box year after year after year, swapping out the comb. If you put a slatted rack underneath of this, it can create another space there and creates more darkness and barrier from this entrance, so they tend to lay their eggs lower and have their brood lower. And then I do not rotate these out, obviously, because the medium does not match the deep. That's it. That's what I do. So that's the advantage. So why doesn't everybody just use mediums if they're all super compatible? Because the deeper frames are easier for the bees to manage. They have a continuous brood pattern that covers the whole frame, and therefore it's more efficient for the bees to manage. This comes from Fabio, New York. I've been keeping bees for 3 years now in Western New York. I guess not too far from you, and looked all over for good information. Your YouTube channel is excellent, and all the good information you provide has helped me a lot. I'm glad. Thank you for saying that. I have an observation to share about hive venting in summer and would appreciate your comments on my winter configuration. I learned you are a believer in no upper venting. We just talked about it. So this summer I was observing my hives and noticed most of them, 7 total, have used upper venting consistently. On my inner covers, which have a circular opening in the center, there is a 3/4 inch hole in the front upper side and a notch lower side on the back. They have used either and sometime both for venting, so I'll let it continue. This is the configuration that I used to have on my hives. If you look at my old videos, I have bee videos from back in 2008. You can see that they all had upper vents and so on. During winter, I add a shim and lay sugar bricks on top of the frames on the brood box as insurance. See, it's already on the brood box in winter, right there. Sugar bricks. Where I wouldn't, because I would have the honey super above that, and then any emergency feeding happens above the honey super. I don't put anything right on the brood. A lot of people do. And as insurance, then I add a Homasote board, looks like drywall, but made of cardboard, I guess, on top of the inner cover to wick the moisture and keep the vents open. The telescopic covers are insulated. I have had 100% survival for 2 winters, but was wondering after watching your videos whether they would have an easier time keeping themselves warm if I close the vents. Any thoughts? Yes, my thoughts are my bees prefer no venting. It's not that I don't provide them with vents, because I do. So we're going to look at this feeder shim again that's on most of my hives now. Again, I don't do everything the same on every hive every year because I want to see the comparison. Did those with the feeder shims do better than those without, with regular hive covers, inner cover, and then the telescoping lid? Now I put screen vents on the bottom so that the entrance is over here, and I control the venting through this by this wheel, this gate. So I have venting that passes through here, and then the bees, so the air would come up through the hive, through these back holes, travel through the box, and then out the front, because I want to impede the progress of the air as much as possible. Also, plugging that center hole is a rapid round feeder. So the only potential venting is through the back. I don't change this configuration when winter comes along. So what happens is during the summertime, because bees like to vent through summer too, we would think most often that they would want to vent the air up and out. The bees come through and propolize every single one of these feeder shims has 100% blocked screens by the bees. So it's not that I didn't give it to them. I provided them all with that opportunity, and all of them had that venting, and every single one of the colonies closed up those vents completely. What does that look like? Looks like that. They sealed it. They wanted no venting through the top. And of course, Dr. Seeley does his evaluations of feral colonies, wild hives, bees in trees, and so on, and they demonstrate there that they don't want upper vents. So my bees have the opportunity to be vented, they just don't. So the reason that people make decisions for the bees, what happens is we think we want that venting to happen, and as mentioned here, you have to put something up there to absorb moisture. If that moisture gets out of hand going through the vent, because warm air would leave the top of your hive. So if I had a vent through the top of this observation hive, the air that they work so hard to build up there, the warmth, the dryness, by the way, the upper part of this hive inside is 100% dry. They're controlling that moisture themselves. So the condensation, as I mentioned before, happens below. Now, if there's a hole through the top of any size, that warm air is going to escape up through it. When it does that, it's going to interact with outside temperature, and then there's going to be another dew point clash there, and there's going to be condensation. So that's where this absorbent material, wood chips, pillows, all the stuff that people like to use up above, because they've allowed air to flow up and out through the top of the hive. Now we have an area where that moist, warm air is going to condense and become damp and wet. And when material like that becomes damp and wet, it's no longer insulating. We need air movement, and the air needs to be dry in order to get rid of that moisture. So as the moisture builds, the ability to insulate becomes removed. So the bees, first of all, demonstrate that. But here's what happens. A lot of beekeepers change configurations going into winter, and that's when they put all the new stuff on. Well, as the temperatures get colder, the bees aren't making new comb. If they're not making new comb and they're not using propolis, because propolis is resin that comes from plants, they need to bring that in and use that to seal tiny joints and cracks in their hive. And that's what they use. This is propolis that they used to seal up these stainless steel screens. So we've taken away their opportunity to seal it up. We've provided venting that they didn't want, that they wouldn't have accepted in most cases, and now they're losing their warm air in winter. And it's up to the bees then to keep up with that, and so we have to provide supplements and make sure that they can handle that cold air and the loss of that warmth that they otherwise seek and would have in the wild. So that's my opinion about that. Now, if Fabio is putting all this together, and they're screened upper vents and all that, I found that they seal up the screens easily. They have a difficult time sealing up those 3/4 inch diameter holes. You'll see a bunch of propolis around it. It appears like they were trying to do it, but they just couldn't quite do that. So if you want to know what the bees choose too, when you put together your swarm traps and things like that, if you put upper vents in a swarm trap, and then you have other swarm traps that only have lower entrances with no upper venting at all, you'll find the bees will be occupying those that have no upper venting over those that do. Now, if there's a swarm trap like that that has tire screens or tiny cracks in the surface of the interior in the upper parts of it, they may still occupy that because they've already assessed it and know, oh, we can seal this up, no problem. So unless it's a big hole, put a 3/4 inch hole in the upper entrance of an observation, not an observation, but in the upper entrance of a swarm trap, and have a lower entrance, which is the configuration we're talking about here. Would the bees occupy that on their own if they had other options? They would not, 9 times out of 10. So what I do is pay attention to what the bees want. I give them the options early enough in the year so they can seal that stuff up and decide whether they want venting through the top. And all of my hives, without exception, have sealed up their upper entrances on their own. So that's how I arrived at not using. It's not that I'm not a believer in hive venting through the top. It's that I believe in using the bees to demonstrate to me how they want to modify that interior and how they want that to be used for venting or not. So if they left it open, they would still be venting now. I wouldn't plug those up, against the will of my bees. Next is from Rodney Middleton. Would the holes in the middles of drawn comb allow the bees to move the cluster horizontal through a hive? I purchased the smock, love it. Oh, talking about the smock right here. Pullover smock by Natural Apiary. Just joined beescape.org. Really neat. Thanks for the video. Okay, now this comes up because bees migrate through, and I'm doing a horizontal hive, long Langstroth hive, and I'm using the long Langstroth standard frames, and some people have said, hey Fred, why didn't you put in acorn frames and stuff like that? Why didn't you use plastic frames in your horizontal hive? For the very reason that we're talking about here with Rodney. I want my bees. This is a wooden framed acorn heavy waxed foundation. Bees cannot, of course, make holes through this and chew through this. And I've actually talked years ago with the guy that runs Acorn Bees, the owner. And we talked about, he has little snap outs in the corners here. And I want to show you what those look like. Hopefully it comes through. If you see there's little punch out holes there in the corners. Hope you can see that. Anyway, that's so that you can pull these out and snap off those corners and the bees can travel frame to frame that way. I left these out of my horizontal hive because I want the bees to have horizontal travel, and I did not leave a lot of space on the ends of these inside that long Langstroth hive. So then what the bees do on their own, and we're going to use natural foundationless comb to demonstrate that. What the bees do on their own is they leave travel space. So they don't go outside the frame to move. And I'm going to get my little flashlight here again, because look what's up here. That is a hole that they travel through. This is a hole that they travel through. So they leave venting and travel passages through the comb, and a lot of times they'll even cut a hole that's the size of a single cell. You'll see bees disappear into a single cell, and like some kind of circus trick, one bee after another keeps coming out of that same tiny hole, but the truth is it's a passageway through the frames. And so the bees are at liberty to modify that, but guess what the bees have never done in my experience? They've never made a hole right through the center of that. So I was talking with the owner, and I was like, hey, why don't you make a hole in the middle of your acorn frames, a punch out, so we have the opportunity to knock that out if we want to, just like we have these corners to knock out if we want to use those. And all the bees did, he said they thought about that. All the bees did when there was a hole through the center was they made drone comb there, and they tended to seal it right up. So, it's a good idea. but the punch outs on the corners appear to be enough, and the bees themselves most of the time, make their travel routes through the bottom and through the sides and sometimes the upper corners of the honeycomb. So that's it. And thanks for mentioning Beescape, BEESCAPE.org. If you want to find out what the resources are, where you live, and to see if your environment's going to support bees, and if there are pesticides in use where you live, and if the odds are against your bees, that is a great place to go to join, to learn, see the topography, find out what's going on. So that was my last question for the day. Thank you for submitting those, all of you who did. I appreciate that you were here. And you're wondering maybe why, if it's 80 degrees in here, why am I wearing a hoodie? Because this just showed up on Teespring. It's made by Hanes, cotton hoodie, full zips. You don't have to pull stuff over your head. And I decided to go with like this athletic gray, because when you're in your apiary checking things out, the bees don't care about this color at all. And they won't come after you. Also, it says on the back, it says the way to be. I hope you can see it. So if you want to get one of those, do that. Don't forget that if you want to remember that you've watched this video, to click the like button down below, and then when you see that, you'll know that you've already watched it, because there are 75 of them after all. And if you want to submit your questions, as we talked about before, please leave them down in the comment section below this video, or follow the link in the video description to my main website, and there's a form that you can fill out there. And I do not have to mention your name. If you don't want your name mentioned, just post your question and say, please don't mention my name. So that's it. What do we have blooming outside right now? Thank goodness we got the rain hit. And nectar's coming in. The next video I'm trying to do, if the weather cooperates, I'm going to show you how to remove comb honey from your hives. And thanks for watching. Thanks for being here today. And I hope that you have a fantastic beekeeping weekend. Thanks a lot.